Hi, everyone. Excuse we're trying to get this together. It's been a while. We're back with Mindy. Hey.
Yay.
Yeah, we haven't done one of these in over a year. Hasn't it been over a year?
Probably about a year. Yeah.
About a year, yeah. So it's nice to be back with Mindy Galati. I guess we'll do some introductions for folks who are seeing us for the first time. My name is Bunmi Emenanjo. I am the founder of Atlas Book Club. We are a book subscription box company focused on globally diverse children's books. And I am so excited to be chatting with Mindy today. And I'll let Mindy introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be back and having these conversations. My name is Mindy Galati. I am an attorney and a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant here in Austin, Texas, and I work with companies and law firms and organizations all around the country. I have two little kids, a 7 and a 9-year-old, and excited to have this conversation today.
Yes, and you can find, before we forget, because we tend to forget this, we're so excited and engrossed in the discussion, we tend to forget where you can find us. You can find Mindy at fundamentalsadvisory.com, right?
Yes, fundamentaladvisory.com.
Okay, and you can find me at atlasbookclub.com. Of course, you're here on our Facebook page, so you found that. We're also on Instagram at atlasbookclub.com. And so we're going to get into it. So if you've been here before, or well, if you haven't been here, we'll give you a little bit more information, but we've been having these conversations and we started last year. I think some of the topics that we've covered is how to diversify your child's library. Another topic we covered is how to have difficult conversations with your children about race. And that was born out of the climate in our country last year with the late George Floyd. And so we've been having these awesome conversations and we wanted to come back. We've rested and are ready and we wanted to come back as the kids are going back to school to have a different kind of conversation. Our past conversation has been based on what you do as a parent, like how do you fill your homes with diverse books? How do you talk to them about race? But now the conversation we're going to have today is how do you arm your children? How do you teach them, teach them to fish, for lack of a better term? How do you teach them so that when they're on their own, where they're out in the world, they're making the kinds of decisions that you want them to make because you've provided a certain foundation for them. And so that's the conversation we're going to be having today. And so, Mindy, you and I talked a little bit prior to this, and you mentioned something that I cannot wait to hear more about. You mentioned something called narrative of difference. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one thing that I have tried to do as a parent, and I teach a lot about it to the companies and that I work with, is about having a positive narrative of difference. And so what a narrative of difference is think about when you meet somebody who's different than you, whatever that difference may be, whether they're different race, whether they're from a different country, whether they're a different gender identity than you, where does your mind initially go, right? Are you curious and interested about them? Do you want to learn more? Do you want to engage? Or are you scared? Are you nervous? Do you at a dinner party or at an event, do you steer away from people that are different than you? And for me as a parent, it's really important that I give my kids a healthy narrative of difference and a positive one, so that when they encounter somebody who's different than them, and difference can mean a whole bunch of things, region of the country, accent, socioeconomic status, abilities, that instead of, walking away, they lean in and they want to learn more. Tell me about where you're from. What is it like to be in a wheelchair? What is it like to be transgender, instead of, kind of sneaking away and wondering? And so all of us have a narrative of difference. And I would encourage everybody on this call today to think about, what is your narrative of difference? Like, what do you do when you meet somebody? If a neighbor pulls up and they unloading the moving van and they look vastly different than you, what are you going to do? Are you interested to learn about them? Or are you a little scared, suspicious, nervous? Either way is okay, but as you start to understand your narrative of difference, it will help you as a parent, but then you can help to instill that healthy, positive narrative of difference in your kids.
And that's the thing. So we're talking today about raising culturally curious kids. And you touched on something while you were describing what a narrative of difference is, that curiosity. Like, kids are inherently curious. They really are. They are going to ask questions, and they are going to wonder about a lot of things. And so how they react in those situations is based on how we react. Like, what's our reaction when we come across someone who's different from us? Or what's our reaction when we come across a culture or an aspect of culture that we don't know, that we don't understand? And we model all these behaviors for our kids. And because they're inherently curious, they're going to be curious anyway. Now, it's important to arm them and provide those tools to them, so they can move forward from that curiosity. And what do they do next after that curiosity is initiated? Like, are they diving even deeper to learn more about the culture that they've been exposed to, or are they having a negative reaction? So I think that's a really great point. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I find is that opening that door to allowing your kids to be curious and ask you a lot of questions, and going there with them, right, is so interesting. And I was just thinking as you were talking, we were on a long road trip this summer, and we kept seeing these trucks driving by us that said Sikhs in trucking, and I've never seen this before, right? And the kids and I were chatting about it. And then on one of our stops, I Googled, what is Sikhs in trucking? Like, what is this? And there's a whole group of Sikh folks in the United States that are truckers, and they have these beautiful truck cabs, and it's an interesting cultural feature of part of the trucking industry. And that's all it is, right? You just tell your kids, like, I've never seen that before. That's so interesting. I'm going to look it up and I'm going to read about it. And right there was just a teachable moment to allow them to not just pass that opportunity by, but to lean in and be like, I would like to know more. It's very simple to inspire curiosity in your kids, because like Bunmi said, the kids are already curious. And so we kind of have to go back to our childlike mind as well and be curious and lean into things that we don't know. And that helps the kids as well.
And that's one of the first points we wanted to make in this conversation. So if you're taking notes, the first is feed that curiosity. They're curious anyway. How are you feeding that curiosity? So I've given this example before, especially, I think this was at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was on my phone a lot. I'm on my phone a lot anyway. And so I had made a conscious effort to diversify my social media feed, particularly my Instagram. Like, what kind of people am I following on Instagram? What does it look like? Am I just seeing people who look like me and who love jollof rice like me, or do I have a diversity of personalities on my Instagram feed? And one of the people that I follow, her, if you're looking for someone to follow, is Indigenous Baddie, Baddie. And I think she's based in Canada and a member of the First Nations. And I was scrolling, and she had a reel up where she had her beautiful traditional dress on, and my daughter, who was hanging over my shoulder as they typically do, she's like, oh, I love what she's wearing. What is she wearing? What is this? And I said, well, she is first, I think I didn't know if she was First Nations there, but I was like, oh, this is Native American, which of course, again, after further research, there's a difference between First Nations and Native American. And I said, that's, one of their traditional wear. And she's like, oh, and she was just so intrigued because she loves fashion. Like, well, let's learn a little bit more. And then, we ended up on Google. I mean, Google is just seriously, we have the whole world at our fingertips. And, and we learned about different Native American tribes, where they are in the country, and we just dive in. And so that's an example of how you can feed that curiosity. And so in doing that, you're helping them become culturally curious, right? And helping raising those kinds of kids. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is, as we're going back to school now, your kids they've been home this whole time, and you, to some extent, have had some influence on what they're reading, like the books that they're reading and, what they're watching on Netflix, for example. But now they're going to school, they're going in person, most of the country is, and they're going to be going to their school library, and they're going to be going to book fairs where you can't be with them 24 hours a day. So how do you arm them so that when they go to school, they reach for that diverse and inclusive book? They reach for that book that, even if they're African American, for example, they're reaching for a book that has an Indian American on the cover. Or if they're white, they're reaching for a book that has a Native American child on the cover. And so how do you do that? This is part of that cultural curiosity. And so one thing I want to encourage you all to do is teach your kids to advocate for those types of books, right? So if they're in the library and they happen, this is an example that I was going to share. If they happen to have a friend who's, from South Korea or has a South Korean heritage, for example, and they go, oh, I want to learn more about my friend, or I want to learn more about their heritage. And they go to the library and they can't find any books with Korean characters as the protagonist, as the main character, right? Teach them to actually advocate and talk to the librarian and say, hey, where are the books that have, Korean main characters? Where are the books that have Latinx characters? Where are the books that have neurodiverse characters? Where are the books that have, kids who are transgender? Teach them to advocate for those kinds of books, because if enough kids are asking for it, the school will have to do something, right? And even when they go to the book fairs and you give them those $20 to buy all these books, teach them to look for those types of books.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think that, this is sort of the building blocks. We talked about feeding that curiosity at home and then setting them up to go into the world to be able to ask questions and to advocate. And it doesn't have to be, they don't have to lead a protest or a march. They can simply ask a librarian, like, hey, I noticed we don't have any books, that feature this sort of character or tell this sort of story. Is there any way we can do that? Most librarians that I know would be really excited to hear a kid ask for a type of a book. And I think that's, really important. It builds their confidence. It builds their ability to ask questions. And something that, we had talked about earlier is, earlier when we were preparing for this talk was, when you want your kids to be advocates, you have to be comfortable with them challenging you as well, and allowing them to have dialogue with you. And we'll probably get a little bit deeper in this in just a few minutes. But as you're teaching kids to advocate and look beyond their story, if you've instilled curiosity, if they have a healthy narrative of difference, they can go into their schools and really be the change, right? Like it's more important for the kids to lead this at a certain age, right? Age appropriate than the parents writing an angry letter saying, why are there no kids of color being represented at the book fair? It's better if a kid says, why am I not being represented at the book fair? I think it's a lot more powerful, but you have to give your kids the ability to challenge even you at home and even some of the things that you bring into the home, right? So if you are buying or consuming media in a way that is very, centered on your identity or is not very diverse, be open to your kids challenging you, right? I always say that feedback or challenges are a gift. It helps us all grow, and so accept that from your kids as well.
Yeah. And you know what? You made such a great point, because I have an example of that. One of our Atlas parents, she's Nigerian American, his son's Nigerian American, and he attends a mostly white school. And he got this box. It was one of our books that featured Nigeria, the book Ikenga. So that's a fantastic book by Nnedi Okorafor, if anyone's looking for a good middle grade book. And featured, a main character who was a boy who was Nigerian, right? And so he read this book and he saw himself represented in that book, right? And he saw himself in that book. And then this is the part that really, really touched me. He now then took that book to his school library and talked to his librarian and advocated for that book to be added to the library, because according to his mom said he felt seen in that book and he wanted to share that with his classmates. So that's an example. If you're doing this at home on a consistent basis, your kids feel empowered. They feel empowered to go out into the world and do that as well. I want to say really quickly, if you have any questions, so we're keeping track of questions. Let me make sure I'm checking on here. If you have any questions, drop your questions in the comments and we'll get to them as soon as possible. And so, oh yeah, so the other thing that I wanted to mention is you had mentioned kids, allowing our kids to challenge even us as parents, right? Because we don't know it all, you know, and we're still learning, and we have to be open and receptive to that. And when we are receptive to that and we allow them to challenge us, in which of course, after they challenge us, then it's an opportunity to, again, feed that curiosity, but dive into even deeper and do some research and have a great dialogue. When they're empowered to do that at home, they're empowered to do it in school. They're empowered to do it out when you're not with them. And so another point is you want to encourage your kids to challenge societal norms. Allow that to be a thing, because there are so many norms and things out there. I used a different word, Mindy, when you and I were talking. Yeah, there's so much stuff out there that is what's the word? That's just wrong. There's just so much stuff, so many stereotypes out there that we just accept, you know, because we've been programmed that this is an acceptable norm, whether it's standards of beauty or whether it's, you know, stereotypes and single story narratives about certain people or certain culture. We've just accepted that. But now we need to teach our kids to challenge that, to feel comfortable and empowered, challenge it, whether they're in class. And, you know, these kinds of conversations start to happen like around 4th grade, when they start learning more about Christopher Columbus and things like that. And we have to empower a kid so they feel comfortable and empowered to challenge their teachers, for example. That's what education is all about, of course, in a respectful manner. But if their teacher is clearly teaching something that's not factually accurate, they should feel comfortable challenging that. And so one example I'll give is the beginning of the pandemic, we binge watched Avatar, the animated series, Avatar and Legends of Korra. And so, you know, me and my kids are like 14, 12, and 10, we binged it and they absolutely loved it. And so when that was over, we let them know, oh, there's a live action version of it that came out about 10 years ago. And they wanted to see it. And my husband and I were like, it's not a great version, but we didn't tell them why. But I tell you, kids pick up on these things, because once they started watching that movie, they go, wait a minute, why are all the characters white? Avatar was set in Asia. You know, why are the characters not Asian characters? They immediately picked up on it. And so that's an example of encouraging that type of challenge to what some may deem acceptable, but isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this point that we're making of allowing your kids to challenge societal norms, allow them to challenge familial norms, like what goes on in your family. And this is a lot to do as kids start to grow into adolescence, and, you know, they have self-expression and they may do or think or you know, things differently. It's really important to give them that space. And it's really important as a parent. One way that I foster dialogue around these topics is, you know, if we're watching something or we're reading a book or we're, you know, having any sort of conversation, I will point out as a starter, like, for example, and you've heard this example before, but we were watching Stranger Things, and it was a scene at a dance, and, you know, all the boys were awkward waiting for a girl to ask them. And I said, you know, isn't it interesting, you know, that it's always like a boy and a girl have to dance. What do you all think about that? So I just said, isn't it interesting that it's always a boy and a girl? What do you think about it? I didn't tell them what I thought about it. And then both kids said, yeah, like, it's not always going to be a boy and a girl. And maybe the boys should just dance together as friends, and it doesn't have to be so lovey. And they had this whole dialogue. And so one way as a parent that you can foster them to be able to challenge norms. So maybe they don't have that ability yet, or they're not as confident yet, is to just ask them, what do you think? So, what do you think about the story that we read? What do you think about these characters and how they're interacting? What do you think about, something you've seen on the news? And let them have their space, and don't disagree with them, right? Let them have their point of view, and then really foster that. And the other thing I want to say is, as your kids are curious and they start to be little advocates and they do challenge norms and beliefs, you can always reflect on those. So if you do something in your family and they say, why do we do this? Or why does this person think this? Don't be afraid of that, right? Dig into it. And then the other part of that is, if your kids raise an issue to you, and we as parents want to think we know a lot, but we don't know everything, of course. And you have to have some humility around understanding other cultures. I call it culture of humility, and just having an understanding we're not going to know everything about other cultures. But you can tell your kids, I don't know, to some things, right? So if you're reading a book, or you're, out in public and your kids ask you a question and you really don't know, just say, I don't know, let's find out together. And that's how you become curious together. And sometimes I will stop, middle of, walking in a store because the kids have asked me a question. I'm like, I don't know, let me actually look that up. And Google is amazing, because we can just stop in the middle of, Michael's while shopping for crafts and Google some historical narrative that we don't know about. And this is the way to show them that you don't have to just fill in lack of information with assumptions and attitudes and stereotypes. You can be thoughtful enough to take the time and reflect, research, read, understand, and get other perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. So good. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I have like a couple more notes, but maybe we'll do part two. Maybe we'll do part two of this, because I have a few things that have come to mind as we've been talking. So, but let's answer a couple of questions. So here's one, and I'll punt this to you, Mindy, because it's a Texas question. In Texas,
Oh, yikes.
with critical race theory being outlawed in schools, how are you augmenting those conversations with your kids at home?
So I would say, whether or not Texas bans whatever, you as a family have a responsibility to talk to your kids about race, racism, the true history of our country. And so, it's something that I have fostered with my kids since they were little, right? And so the way you supplement it is you make conversations around race and oppression a very common, if not daily, conversation, and you just normalize it. And look, they can't learn everything at school anyways. And so we have to deal with, laws, we have to deal with, oppressive regimes of, Texas. And what I would say is that it's a beautiful learning experience to do this with your kids. You will probably learn just as much as your kids about race and racism if you start talking about it. And so critical race theory is very misunderstood. Again, Google the real people who came up with it, Kimberly Crenshaw and others. Dig into the conversation. However, I think with kids, it's really setting that narrative of difference, giving them an eye into the true history of the country and why these things exist, right? My son read, he's 9, he read the young adult version of Stamped from the Beginning called Stamped. He's also read a book he just finished called Conversations with a Black Boy. It's the conversations with a Black man, but like for kids. And we talk about this, right? And we talk about, the complexities and the things that are hard. And kids can understand this, right? You just open the door in your home. And if you open the door in your home and you let kids ask you hard questions, they will be able to do that as adults and as they get older and out in public, right? So they will be able to advocate and challenge, because you have given them this solid, loving space to ask these things and to grow. And so they'll be able to do out there. But Texas is hot. I live here. My kids, are being raised here. But, whether or not Texas bans, they can't ban me from being their mom. And so I'll continue to teach them as much as I can.
And, I don't live in Texas, but I think this applies to anyone, no matter where you live. Children's books. We say that, I feel like I say it ad nauseum. Authors have done all the work for you. Like, they really have. And I think authors are so brilliant because they take complex information, complex historical information or current day. They just take complex social issues, and they have somehow in their brilliant minds written a children's book and basically given language to this complex social issues in a manner that a child can easily digest it. They've done the work for you. Like seriously, all you have to do is read along with your kid. Pick up a middle grade book, even picture books. I mean, there's a beautiful picture book. It's in one of our bundles called Tomorrow, and it's set in Syria. And it's basically, showing this little boy and how his life has been impacted by the war in Syria, and how his mother used to paint in the park, but now she paints in the house, and how he can go to his favorite playground. Like the author has, and the illustrators have done this so beautifully that it's easily digestible for a child. And whether it's picture books or middle grade books, like someone asked earlier in another group about historical fiction books, and I listed a few, and a good one, again, Syria comes to mind, called Other Words for Home. That book is amazing because it's a middle grade book, and it talks in depth about the life of this young Syrian girl, a teenager in Syria before the war, and then when she had to migrate to the United States and live here, and some of the racism that she faced when she got here, but then also the trauma of being torn from your home and coming here. And it's a middle grade book, and it's 100% age appropriate. So don't shy away from this difficult topics because you don't have the language to communicate with the kids. There are people who've done that work for you, and just pick up your children and read along with your child and discuss. My son, who's 14, and I have been reading the March series by the late John Lewis. And so when you read along with your child also as an adult, even if it's a book that you've read before, because you're reading it through the eyes of your child, you see things a little bit differently and you learn something different. So just wanted to add that to what you said, Mindy. Let me see if there are any more questions.
One thing I'll quickly add is that
sure,
you're right about picture books too. And you can read picture books for a long time to kids, right? Kids like them for a long time. And remember when you're reading them to ask that question, what do you think? What did that book make you think about? And don't tell them your answer first. And a lot of times there are so many children's books on tough topics that give you the language. So if you don't know the language, these children's books will get you there, right? And they will, that bond between a parent and a child talking about really tough things. I mean, it's amazing. And just make sure you're always asking, what do you think? What's your perspective? And that creates that narrative in your kids and in your home that it's an open space for that dialogue.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we'll take one more question. My children are biracial and very young, both under the age of 4. We read very diverse books and stories, but I would like to explore the inequities of difference more deeply with my older child. What are some strategies to have or prepare for rich discussions at this age, under 4? So like I mentioned before, there are lots of picture books that have that very effectively narrate this complex social issues. So one that I mentioned was Tomorrow, that's set in Syria. I mean, there's off the top of my head, I can't think of any right now. But I would say picture books, use picture book, because at 4 years old, you have to be able to communicate this to a child in a manner that they understand. And picture books are a great way to do that. But then also just really simplify it. What does it all boil down to at the end of the day? It's just love, right? Kids understand that. They understand like, oh, this person, it doesn't matter where they're from or what the color of this, I should treat them the way I want to be treated, right? So at the end of the day, that's all it boils down to. And then also celebrating the differences, so that those are really the foundations. This person is from India, for example, and I think a festival, we have, is it the Holi festival? that might be coming up in November. I might have gotten that wrong, but celebrating those kinds of cultures, celebrating those festivals. So that way you communicate to your child that differences should be celebrated, not just merely tolerated. They should be celebrated. And so those are just a few examples. If you go to we have a bookshop.org shop, an Atlas Book Club shop on bookshop.org. And so we have book lists there, so there are plenty of book recommendations. If you're not an Atlas subscriber, you can purchase from the book list on bookshops, and that supports independent bookstores. So Mindy?
And the one thing I would say is that, so I have multi-ethnic, multiracial kids. And one of the books I bought for them when they were like 2, 3 years old is called Marigold McDonald Doesn't Match. Mm-hmm. And it's about having, a white mom. I think the dad is white and the mom is from Peru. Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful, right? It's got great pictures and it's a cute little story. But again, you can keep asking, what do you think about this? What is this like? There's also a picture book called The Middle Passage. It is breathtaking. It makes it, when I first got it, it made me it was horrifying. It was beautiful to read to the kids, but it's just pictures about the enslavement in the Middle Passage. And you can broach some really hard topics through kids' books. And I think it's healthy for them to see this as children and to have that experience with their parents. And so definitely fill your library with a diverse amount of books. It sounds like you've done that, diverse perspectives, don't have a single narrative about different people. But then there are some really tough topics that you can broach. There's books about death. There's books about being disabled. There's books about gender fluidity. Julian is a Mermaid is a beautiful book. If you can pick that one up. And again, if you start when they're that little, when they're under 4, it just becomes part of their dialogue, and it does give them that healthy narrative of difference. And so, and check out her, the book list that she's mentioned. That's great. We could talk about books and book lists all day.
We like really could. I'm looking at the time now. I'm like, we just like barely scratched the surface here. But I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to wrap it up. Drop the questions and I'll come through, and I know Mindy usually does that too, and answer some questions in the comments. Thank you for joining us. I do want to say that Atlas Book Club, you can find us at www.atlasbookclub.com. We're in September. We're exploring the diversity of France. Last month we explored South Korea. This month we're exploring France. So feel free to subscribe, and all our past boxes are in sale. We have a Labor Day sale, so go to the website and browse the past boxes if you're interested. And Mindy, again, is at fundamentaladvisory.com for your DEI consultation needs. So,
and we will be doing our next talk on October 1st.
Yes.
October 1st, Friday, same time, same place. So we'll be back again. Send us questions because they may inform our next conversation as well. So October 1st, 5 p.m. Eastern.
I am so glad we did this. We're glad to be back. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Mindy. Bye. Have a fun 3-day weekend if you have Monday off. So thanks, everyone. Bye.